He was 18 when his stepmother handed him a key and told him he was a man now. What she didn't tell him was that the key went to a worthless, dilapidated tool shed on a forgotten plot of land, and that what he would find inside was not just his inheritance, but the truth that would save his life. If you've ever been told you're on your own, if you've ever been made to feel worthless, then I need you to listen to this story. Hit that subscribe button, because what we talk about here is finding value in the places everyone else has written off, including ourselves. The day I turned 18 was the day my life ended, or so I thought. There was no cake, no cards, just a single cardboard box on the porch and the sound of the front door locking behind me. Diane, my stepmother, stood on the other side of the glass, her face a mask of strained politeness. She held up a single, rusty key. "Your father wanted you to have this," she said, her voice muffled. "It's the key to the old workshop. The property is yours now, all of it." She made it sound like a grand gesture, a benevolent gift. But I knew better. I'd heard the arguments for months, ever since Dad got sick. Whispers of useless land, money pit, a burden we can't afford. This wasn't a gift. This was an eviction notice wrapped in the thin tissue of inheritance. My box was light. It contained 2 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book my dad used to read to me, my toothbrush, and an envelope with $200 inside. "For the bus ticket and a meal," the note from Diane read, in her perfect, sterile cursive. No signature, just the words. The finality of it felt like a slap. 2 years. 2 years since my dad had passed, and in that time I had become a ghost in my own home. I moved through the hallways, trying to take up as little space as possible, my grief a silent, heavy coat I couldn't take off. Diane's grief, if she had any, was sharp and practical. It manifested in cleaning out closets, selling my dad's old truck, and replacing his worn leather armchair with something gray and modern that nobody ever sat in. She was erasing him, and now she was erasing me. I stood on the manicured lawn, the sprinkler system hissing to life on its automated schedule, and looked at the house. My house. The one I'd grown up in. The one where my dad taught me how to ride a bike on the driveway, leaving a trail of wobbly chalk lines. The one where the height chart was still faintly visible on the kitchen door frame, pencil marks tracking my journey from a small boy to a lanky, uncertain teenager. Now it was just a building, and I was just a trespasser. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Fear. It was a pure, undiluted fear that I hadn't felt since the night the doctor told us the treatments weren't working. The key felt cold and jagged in my palm. The workshop. I vaguely remembered it. Dad used to call it the sanctuary. It was a small plot of land about 3 hours north, something his own father had left him. We'd gone up there a few times when I was a kid, for camping trips that were more about swatting mosquitoes and trying to build a fire with damp wood than actual camping. I remembered a small, rickety building that smelled of sawdust and rain. Dad would spend hours in there, tinkering with old engines or carving little wooden animals. He said the air was different there, cleaner. I didn't understand it then. To me, it was just a boring, buggy place far away from my friends. Now it was apparently my only possession in the world, a worthless tool shed. The words echoed in my head, a mix of Diane's dismissiveness and my own despair. I didn't argue. I didn't bang on the door or shout through the glass. What was the point? The battle had been lost long ago in a series of quiet, strategic maneuvers I was too young and too grief-stricken to even notice. Selling the truck was for practical reasons. Changing the joint bank account was simpler for estate planning. Each step was a brick being laid in the wall between me and my own life, and the final brick had just been mortared into place. I picked up my box, slid the key into my pocket, and walked away from the only home I had ever known without looking back. Because if I looked back, I was afraid the emptiness would swallow me whole. I walked down the curved suburban street, past identical houses with perfectly green lawns, and felt like I was on a movie set. None of it was real. The only real things were the cardboard digging into my hip and the cold, hard lump of fear in my gut. The bus station was a different world. It smelled of exhaust fumes, stale coffee, and a kind of transient desperation that I was quickly becoming familiar with. I bought my ticket from a tired-looking woman behind a pane of smudged glass. Northbridge, I said, the name feeling foreign on my tongue. She grunted and slid the ticket under the glass. One way. Of course it was one way. I had $94 left. I used 4 of them on a bottle of water and a bag of pretzels from a vending machine, then found a hard plastic seat to wait. The people around me were a blur of weary faces. A young mother trying to soothe a crying baby, an old man asleep with his mouth open, a group of soldiers in uniform laughing quietly amongst themselves. They all had somewhere to be, someone to see. They had a destination that was a beginning, or at least a middle. Mine felt like an end. As I sat there, the shock began to wear off, replaced by a slow, creeping anger. An anger at Diane for her cold, calculated cruelty. But also an anger at my dad. A hot, guilty anger that churned in my stomach. Why did you leave me? Why didn't you protect me? Why did you marry her? He had loved her, I knew that. But his love had been a gentle, quiet thing, and hers was possessive. She loved what he provided, the stability, the beautiful house. After he was gone, the house was all she had left of that, and I was just a leftover piece of him she no longer had a use for. I pushed the thought away. It felt like a betrayal. He'd been sick for so long, so weak at the end. He couldn't have known she would do this. He couldn't have. You must have thought this little plot of land, this workshop, would be something for me, a safety net. But from where I was sitting, it felt less like a net and more like a hole. The bus arrived with a loud hiss of its air brakes, jolting me from my thoughts. I shuffled on with the other passengers, found a window seat near the back, and placed my box on the seat beside me as if to guard it. It was my whole world now. The bus lurched into traffic, and the city began to fall away, replaced by the endless stretch of highway. I watched the landscape change from concrete and strip malls to rolling hills and farmland. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. It was beautiful, but the beauty felt distant, like something happening in another person's life. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window and let the vibration of the road seep into my bones. For the first time all day, I felt the burn of tears behind my eyes. I didn't let them fall. I couldn't. Crying felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. It required a certain amount of hope, the belief that things could get better. And I didn't have that. Not yet. All I had was a one-way ticket to a place I barely remembered, and a key to a building that was probably falling down. I was heading toward a worthless tool shed, but it was the only thing I had left. The bus dropped me off at a crossroads with a single, flickering street lamp. The sign said, Northbridge, 5 miles. There was no station, just a gravel shoulder and a gathering darkness. The air was colder here, crisp and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. It was the smell I vaguely remembered, the one Dad had loved. The bus pulled away, its red taillights disappearing around a bend, leaving me in an unnerving silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets. 5 miles. I looked down the dark, unlit country road, and my heart sank. I hadn't thought about this part. I'd been so focused on just getting there, I hadn't considered the last leg of the journey. My phone had died hours ago, and even if it hadn't, I had no one to call. For a moment, panic seized me. I was completely, utterly alone. I could just sit here on the side of the road and wait for morning. But the thought of spending the night in the open, with the strange sounds of the woods pressing in, was terrifying. So I started walking. I hoisted the box higher on my hip and set off down the road, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the asphalt. The moon was a pale sliver, offering little light. The shapes of the trees on either side of the road looked like hunched monsters in the gloom. Every snap of a twig in the woods sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I thought about my dad on those camping trips. He had never been afraid of the dark. He'd point out the constellations, imitate owl calls, and tell me the woods were more peaceful than any city. I tried to channel some of that courage, but all I felt was the thinness of my jacket and the gnawing emptiness in my stomach. The walk took over 2 hours. My arms ached from the weight of the box, and my feet were sore. I passed a few houses, their windows glowing with warm, yellow light, and felt a pang of longing so sharp it almost took my breath away. They were whole worlds in themselves, families sitting down to dinner, watching TV, living their normal, safe lives. I was on the outside, a ghost walking through their periphery. Finally, I saw it. A rusted mailbox, half hidden by overgrown weeds, with our last name barely legible on the side. Miller. A narrow dirt track led off the main road and into the trees. This was it. I turned onto the path, the soft earth muffling my footsteps. The trees were thicker here, and the darkness was absolute. I stumbled a few times, catching myself on low-hanging branches. And then I saw it. A small clearing, and in the center, a dark, sagging shape against the slightly less dark sky. The workshop. It looked smaller than I remembered, and far more dilapidated. The roofline was crooked, and the porch sagged to one side like a tired old man. The windows were dark, vacant eyes. It didn't look like a sanctuary. It looked haunted. I approached it slowly, my earlier fear replaced by a profound sense of disappointment. This was my inheritance. A collapsing shack in the middle of nowhere. Diane was right. It was worthless. I climbed the groaning steps of the porch, which threatened to give way under my weight. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of wet, rotting wood. I reached the door and fumbled in my pocket for the key. My fingers were numb with cold. The key slid into the lock with a rusty screech. For a heart-stopping moment, it wouldn't turn. I imagined it breaking off, leaving me stranded out here. I put my shoulder into the door, jiggled the key with all my might, and finally, with a loud clunk, the lock gave way. The door swung inward on creaking hinges, opening into a pit of blackness. I stood there, on the threshold, peering into the dark. I didn't have a flashlight. I didn't have anything. I took a hesitant step inside. The floorboards were solid, at least. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of sawdust, oil, and something else. Something like time itself. It was the smell of a place that had been waiting. I left the door open, letting the faint moonlight spill into the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make out basic shapes. A long workbench against the far wall, cluttered with dark, lumpy objects. Shelves lined with jars and cans. A pot-bellied stove in the corner, cold and silent. It was exactly as I remembered it, just coated in a thick layer of dust and draped in cobwebs. I set my box down on the floor, the sound echoing in the stillness. I was exhausted, hungry, and cold. I ran my hand along the workbench, my fingers leaving clean trails in the dust. I found what I was looking for, an old kerosene lamp. I remembered Dad lighting it, the soft, warm glow it cast. I fumbled around on the shelves behind it, and my fingers closed around a familiar rectangular box. Matches. My heart gave a small leap. The first match I struck broke. The second fizzled out. But the third one caught, its tiny flame a defiant beacon in the oppressive darkness. I carefully lit the lamp. The wick caught, sputtered, and then blossomed into a steady, golden light, pushing the shadows back into the corners. The room came to life in the warm glow. I could see the tools now, hanging neatly on a pegboard above the bench. Saws, hammers, wrenches, all coated in a light film of rust, but otherwise well cared for. On the shelves were jars of nails, screws, and bolts, all meticulously sorted. My dad had been a man who believed in order, in having the right tool for the job. In the center of the room was a large, sturdy table, and on it, covered by a dusty canvas cloth, was a project he had never finished. I lifted the cloth. It was a rocking chair, beautifully carved, but only half assembled. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden, washed over me. He had been working on this. He had meant to come back. The lamp flickered, and for a second I could almost see him standing there, a piece of sandpaper in his hand, a small smile on his face. The illusion shattered, leaving me alone again in the dusty silence. I needed to find somewhere to sleep. There was a small door in the back of the workshop that I hadn't remembered. I opened it and found a tiny room, barely big enough for a cot and a small dresser. There was a thin, lumpy mattress on the cot, but it was dry. A couple of thick wool blankets were folded at its base. They smelled of mothballs, but they were a godsend. My immediate future, at least for tonight, seemed to be settled. I could survive here. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was a shelter. As I was about to close the main workshop door for the night, something caught my eye. A loose floorboard near the workbench. It was just a fraction of an inch higher than the others, something you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. My dad had been a meticulous carpenter. He wouldn't have left a board loose by accident. My curiosity piqued. I knelt down. There was no nail. I wedged my fingers into the crack and pulled. The board came up easily, without a sound. Beneath it, nestled in the dark, cool space between the floor joists, was a metal box. It was an old Army surplus ammunition box, painted olive green. It wasn't locked, just sealed with a heavy latch. My heart started to beat faster. What was this? I lifted it out. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been. I set it on the workbench, the metal scraping against the wood. My hands were trembling slightly as I undid the latch. It sprang open with a metallic pop. I lifted the lid. Inside there was no treasure, no gold, no weapons. There was just a thick stack of envelopes tied together with a piece of twine. And on top of the stack was a single, smaller envelope with my name, Leo, written on it, in my father's familiar, blocky handwriting. I sank onto a dusty stool, the lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The world outside, Diane, the bus ride, the cold, lonely walk, it all faded away. There was only me, this dusty workshop, and a message from the past, a message from my dad. I picked up the envelope with my name on it. The paper was thick and creamy, not like the cheap stationery Diane used. I turned it over in my hands, tracing the letters of my name. It felt like he was in the room with me. I took a deep breath and carefully tore it open. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the lines of his handwriting. "My dearest Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and things have probably not gone the way I'd hoped. I'm so sorry, son. I'm sorry for leaving you, and I'm sorry if you are here because you have nowhere else to go. I know Diane. I loved her, but I was not blind to her practicality. She sees this place as a liability, a piece of worthless land. I see it differently. This place isn't an inheritance, Leo. It's a key." I had to stop and read that line again. A key. What did that mean? I continued reading. "Your grandfather built this workshop with his own 2 hands. He was a good man, a quiet man, but he believed in being prepared. He taught me that some things are worth more than their market value. This land is one of those things. I tried to tell Diane, but she only understands dollars and cents. She wouldn't understand legacy. She wouldn't understand home." The letter went on to explain. He knew he was sick, sicker than he was letting on. He had started making arrangements. He couldn't fight Diane on the big things, the house, the money in the bank. He didn't have the strength left. So he focused on this. He secretly funneled what little cash he could into this place. He paid the property taxes years in advance. He set things up so that the property would transfer solely to me on my 18th birthday. A small legal maneuver she wouldn't have noticed in the larger estate paperwork. He was protecting it. For me. "I know it doesn't look like much, son," the letter continued. "It's old and it needs work. But it's ours. It's free and clear. No one can take it from you. Inside this box you'll find other letters. They will explain more. They will tell a story you need to hear. Don't read them all at once. Read them when you need them. They are your map. There is also something else in this box, at the very bottom. A start. It's not much, but it was all I could put aside without her noticing. Use it wisely. Build something. Or just breathe. This place is for you to breathe. Know that I love you, Leo, more than words can say. I am always with you. Love, Dad." I finished the letter, and the tears I'd been holding back all day finally came. They weren't tears of sadness or fear anymore. They were tears of relief, of love. He hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't forgotten me. He had seen this coming. He had built me a lifeboat, a tiny, rickety, dusty lifeboat. But it was enough. It was everything. I sat there in the quiet workshop, the lamplight glowing, and cried. I cried for my dad, for the man I had missed so much. I cried for the boy who had walked away from his home that morning, feeling completely alone. And I cried for the young man who had just found out he wasn't. After a while, my tears subsided, leaving behind a strange sense of calm. I felt my father's presence in that room, not as a ghost, but as a warmth, a steadying hand on my shoulder. I looked at the metal box again. I untied the twine around the other letters. There were at least a dozen of them, each in its own envelope, numbered in sequence. A map, he had called it. A story. I resisted the urge to tear them all open. Read them when you need them, he'd said. I trusted him. I lifted the stack of letters out of the box, and underneath, just as he'd promised, was something else. It was a thick canvas bank bag. I lifted it out. It was heavy. I loosened the drawstring and turned it upside down. Bundles of cash, held together with rubber bands, fell onto the workbench. 50s and 20s. I started counting, my hands shaking. It wasn't a fortune, not by a long shot, but it was more money than I had ever seen in my life. $10,000. A start. I just stared at it. $10,000. It was enough to get a cheap apartment somewhere, enough to eat for months, enough to disappear and start over. I could leave this shed, this worthless piece of land, and never look back. The thought was tempting. It was the easy way out. But then I looked around the workshop, at the half-finished rocking chair, at the neatly organized tools, at the letter from my father still clutched in my hand. He hadn't saved this money for me to run away. Build something, he'd written. He had left me not just money, but a place, a foundation, and a story I hadn't even begun to read. I carefully stacked the money back into the bag and placed it back in the metal box, under the letters. I put the floorboard back in its place. No one would ever know it was there. That night, I slept in the small cot in the back room, wrapped in the mothball-scented blankets, and for the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like I was home. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birdsong. Sunlight streamed through the grimy window of the small room, illuminating swirling dust motes. For a moment, I was disoriented, unsure of where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The eviction, the bus ride, the workshop, the letter. My inheritance. I sat up, the wool blanket scratching my chin. The cold morning air was invigorating. I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I had work to do. My first priority was survival. I took $20 from the cash box and walked the 5 miles back into Northbridge. The town was small, the kind of place with one main street, a diner, a general store, and a post office. People nodded as I passed, their gazes curious but not unfriendly. I was clearly an outsider. In the general store, I bought the basics: bread, peanut butter, canned soup, coffee, a box of matches, soap, a cheap flashlight. The woman behind the counter, a middle-aged lady with kind eyes and a name tag that read Martha, gave me a warm smile. "New in town?" she asked. "Something like that," I replied. "Just staying out at the old Miller place." Her smile tightened slightly. "Oh, that place. Hasn't been anyone out there in years. Not since Frank passed. You're his boy, then?" I nodded. "Leo." "Well, Leo," she said, bagging my groceries, "it's good to have a Miller back on that land. Your father was a good man. If you need anything, you just let us know." Her kindness was a small, welcome gift. It made me feel a little less alone in the world. Back at the workshop, I spent the rest of the day cleaning. It was a massive undertaking. I swept away years of dust and cobwebs, washed the windows until the sunlight could properly stream in, and wiped down every surface. As I worked, I felt a growing connection to the space. This wasn't just some random building. It was a place my father and grandfather had loved. Every tool I picked up, I imagined my dad's hands holding it. Every jar of screws I organized, I saw his patient, methodical nature. I found an old hand pump well out back, and after a lot of rusty, squealing effort, I managed to get it working, pumping out clear, ice-cold water. I washed myself with a bar of soap, the cold water a shocking but welcome jolt. That evening, I heated a can of soup on the pot-bellied stove, which I'd managed to get working after cleaning out the flue. I sat at the big work table, eating my simple meal in the warm glow of the kerosene lamp, and felt a quiet satisfaction. I had survived my first full day. I had food, water, and shelter. It was more than I'd had yesterday. After I finished eating, I decided it was time. I pulled out the metal box and took out the next letter, the one marked with a 2. I opened it with a sense of reverence. This time, the letter was longer, more detailed. It told the story of my grandfather, a man I'd never met. He had come back from the war a changed man, quiet and withdrawn. He'd bought this piece of land because he needed a place where the world couldn't touch him. He built the workshop by hand, milling the lumber from trees on the property. It was his escape, his therapy. He taught my father how to work with his hands, how to be self-reliant, how to find peace in quiet labor. He used to say, "Frank, the world will try to knock you down," my dad wrote. "It'll tell you what you're worth, what you can and can't do. Don't you listen. You find a piece of ground, your own piece of ground, and you build your worth yourself." The letter was a revelation. It reframed the workshop in my mind. It wasn't just a building. It was a legacy of resilience, a testament to the idea that you could build your own sanctuary in a world that felt hostile. My dad continued, his tone shifting. "I'm telling you this, Leo, because I think you're going to need that strength. There's something you need to know about Diane and about this land. It's not as simple as her wanting to get rid of a burden. There's more to it." A few years ago, a development company called Stonegate started buying up land in this area. They're quiet about it, making low-ball offers to old-timers, telling them their land is worthless. They plan to build a luxury golf resort. They approached me several times. They want this land, Leo. They want it badly. My blood ran cold. A golf resort. I looked around the rustic, peaceful workshop. The idea of it being bulldozed to make way for a manicured fairway felt like a desecration. "I always told them no," the letter went on. "This land isn't for sale. It's family." But they were persistent. The last offer they made was significant, enough to catch Diane's attention. She saw it as a winning lottery ticket. I saw it as a betrayal of everything my father stood for. We fought about it. It was one of the last big fights we had before I got too sick to argue. She doesn't know that I know the full extent of their plans, or how much they're really willing to pay. She thinks she's being clever, waiting for you to abandon this place so she can declare it derelict and sell it for a fraction of its worth to her contact at the company. Do not let her. Whatever you do not let them win. The letter ended with a piece of advice. In the bottom of the dresser in the back room, there's a false bottom. Your grandfather was a man of many secrets. You'll find all my research on Stonegate in there. The real appraisals, the environmental reports they don't want anyone to see, my correspondence with their lawyer. It's your ammunition. Use it. Your friend in this will be a man named Arthur Vance. He was my lawyer and a good friend. His number is in there. If you get into trouble, call him. Tell him you're Frank Miller's boy. He'll know what to do. Be careful, son. This is a bigger fight than you think." I sat there for a long time after reading the letter, the pieces clicking into place. It wasn't just petty cruelty. It was greed. Diane hadn't just kicked me out. She had tried to cheat me out of my birthright. The anger I'd felt before returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the hot, helpless anger of a victim. It was a cold, clear, focused anger. A fire had been lit inside me. This was no longer just about survival. This was about justice. It was about honoring my father's last wish. I went into the back room and examined the old wooden dresser. It took me a few minutes, but I found it. A small notch on the underside of the bottom drawer. I pulled, and the false bottom came loose. Inside was a thick manila folder. I took it back to the table and opened it. It was exactly as my dad had described. Stacks of documents. Appraisals that valued the land at 10 times what Stonegate had offered. Reports detailing how their proposed development would pollute the local watershed. And copies of letters between my dad and a lawyer from Stonegate, with my dad's firm, polite refusals, and the lawyer's increasingly aggressive replies. He had been fighting them all along, even as he was dying. He had been protecting me, protecting this land, in a way I never could have imagined. This worthless tool shed wasn't just a shelter. It was the heart of a battleground. And my father had just handed me the battle plans. I've had to make some hard choices in my life. We all have. And sometimes the path of least resistance looks so tempting. Just take the easy way out, avoid the fight. But what my dad taught me through these letters is that sometimes the fight is the whole point. Sometimes standing your ground is the only thing that lets you know who you are. I want to take a moment and speak directly to you. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you. It means a lot. Maybe you're here because you faced a similar situation. Maybe you've been underestimated, written off, or had to fight for something that everyone else told you was worthless. If that's you, I want you to know you are not alone. This community we're building here, it's for people like us. People who know what it's like to have to build your own worth from the ground up. So if this is hitting home for you, do me a favor. Hit that like button. And in the comments below, I want you to tell me about a time you had to stand your ground. A time you chose the harder path because you knew it was the right one. I'm going to read every single one of your comments because your stories matter. They are a part of this larger story we're all telling together. Your strength inspires me. Now, let's get back to what happened next. The next day, I found Arthur Vance's phone number on a business card tucked inside the folder. I walked back into town, my stomach churning with a mixture of nerves and determination. I used the payphone outside the general store. It felt ancient, like a relic from another time. The phone rang 3 times before a calm, professional voice answered. "Vance Law Office?" "Hello," I said, my own voice sounding shaky. "My name is Leo Miller. I'm Frank Miller's son." There was a pause on the other end of the line. For a second, I thought he might hang up. Then the voice softened. "Leo, my God. Frank talked about you all the time. I was so sorry to hear of his passing. Where are you?" "I'm in Northbridge," I said. "I'm at the workshop." Another pause, this one longer. "I see," Mr. Vance said, his voice now tight with something I couldn't identify. Concern? Anger? Your stepmother told me you'd been taken care of. She said you were living with relatives out of state. The lie was so audacious it almost made me laugh. No, sir, I said. She kicked me out. She told me this place was all I had. There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. That woman, he muttered, more to himself than to me. Leo, listen to me. Don't talk to anyone. Don't sign anything. Can you get to my office? It's in the city, about an hour south of you. I don't have a car, I said. Don't worry about that, he replied. I'll send someone, a man named George. He'll be at the crossroads in a black sedan in 2 hours. He's a private investigator I use sometimes. He's discreet. He's a friend. Bring the folder your father left you. The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, the receiver still pressed to my ear, my mind racing. A private investigator, a lawyer in the city. This was real. This was happening. I wasn't just a kid in a shed anymore. I was a player in a game I was only just beginning to understand. 2 hours later, a clean black sedan pulled up to the crossroads. A man with a kind, weathered face and a graying buzz cut got out. Leo? He asked. I nodded. I'm George. Arthur sent me. The ride to the city was quiet. George didn't ask many questions. He just drove, his presence calm and reassuring. It gave me time to think. I watched the rural landscape give way to suburbs and then to the tall buildings of the city. It felt like I was traveling between 2 different worlds. Mr. Vance's office was in a modest but respectable-looking building downtown. He was an older man with a shock of white hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a sad smile. You look like your father, he said, ushering me into his office. The office was cluttered with books and files, and it smelled of old paper and leather. It felt safe. I spent the next 2 hours laying everything out for him. I told him about Diane kicking me out, about the key, the workshop, the letters, the cash. I handed him the folder. He went through the documents carefully, his expression growing more grim with each page he turned. When he was finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me. Your father was a smart man, he said. He knew this was coming. He's built you a fortress, Leo. A legal fortress. He explained the situation in clear, simple terms. Diane had no legal right to sell the property. It was mine, and mine alone. Her plan had been to let me fail. She probably expected me to last a week, maybe 2, before I gave up and abandoned the place. Then she would have petitioned the court to declare the property abandoned, taken control as the executor of my father's estate, and sold it to Stonegate for a fraction of its value, likely with a hefty kickback for herself. But she underestimated you, Mr. Vance said, a glint in his eye. And she underestimated your father. This file, this is dynamite. Your dad documented everything. The lowball offers, their refusal to acknowledge the official environmental surveys, their back-channel communications. He's got them, Leo, and now you've got them. He laid out a plan. We would file an injunction to prevent any sale or transfer of the property. Then we would go on the offensive. We would contact the state's Environmental Protection Agency with the information my father had gathered. We would also file a formal complaint against Diane for her actions as executor of the estate. This is going to get messy, he warned me. They will fight back. They have deep pockets. Are you ready for that? I looked at the file on his desk, my father's legacy of defiance. I thought of the workshop, my small sanctuary. I thought of my grandfather building his own worth from the ground up. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I'm ready." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. True to his word, Mr. Vance filed the injunction. Stonegate's lawyers responded with a blizzard of motions and threats. They tried to claim I was an unstable, squatting on the property. They sent a slick lawyer to try and intimidate me, offering me a generous settlement to just walk away. I remembered my dad's words. I remembered my grandfather. I told him no. Life at the workshop settled into a new routine. I spent my days working on the property, clearing brush, patching the leaky roof, and securing the foundation. I used a small portion of the money my dad had left to buy lumber and tools in town. I was building. With every nail I hammered, I felt like I was rebuilding my own life. Martha, from the general store, became a quiet ally. She'd slip an extra can of soup or a bag of fresh apples into my groceries, refusing payment. "Your dad would have done the same," she'd say with a wink. The town was small, and word had gotten around about the city lawyer and the big development company. I was no longer just the strange kid at the old Miller place. I was Frank Miller's boy, and I was putting up a fight. I continued to read my father's letters, one by one, usually at the end of a long day of physical labor. They were no longer about the legal battle. They were about life. He wrote about his regrets, the times he'd been too busy with work, the arguments he wished he'd never had. He wrote about his love for my mother, who had died when I was very young, and how much he saw of her in me. He wrote about what it means to be a man, not about being tough or emotionless, but about being kind, being responsible, and standing up for what you believe in. Each letter was a gift, a piece of him that I could hold on to. They were teaching me, guiding me, parenting me from beyond the grave. I finished the rocking chair he had started. I sanded it smooth and gave it a coat of varnish. I put it on the porch, and sometimes I would sit there in the evenings, watching the fireflies, and I'd feel him there with me. The turning point came about 2 months after my meeting with Mr. Vance. The state EPA, armed with my father's research, launched a full-scale investigation into Stonegate's proposed development. They found that the company had deliberately falsified their environmental impact reports. The project was halted indefinitely. At the same time, Mr. Vance's complaint against Diane went before a probate judge. Faced with overwhelming evidence of her deception and mishandling of the estate, she was removed as executor. The court appointed a neutral third party to oversee the final settlement of my father's assets. It turned out there was a life insurance policy she had forgotten to mention, a policy with me as the sole beneficiary. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough for college, enough for a real future. I never saw Diane again. Mr. Vance told me she sold the house and moved away. Her reputation in the community shattered. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic courtroom showdown. She just disappeared. And in a way, that was the most fitting end. She had tried to erase me, and in the end, she had been the one to vanish. Life is quiet now. The legal battles are over. The land is safe. It's mine. I decided to stay. I enrolled in a community college in a nearby town, studying forestry and land management. I spend my weekends and evenings at the workshop. It's not a dilapidated shed anymore. I've repaired it, insulated it, even added a small solar panel on the roof for electricity. It's a home, my home. The $10,000 my dad left me is still in the metal box. I never touched it. It felt sacred, like it wasn't meant for bills or groceries. It was seed money, a symbol of his faith in me. Maybe one day I'll use it to build a proper cabin here, or to expand the workshop. For now, it's enough just to know it's there. The other day I was sitting on the porch in the rocking chair my father started and I finished. The sun was setting, filtering through the pine trees, and the air smelled clean and sweet. I thought about the day I arrived here, a scared, angry kid with a single box and a rusty key. I had thought I inherited a worthless tool shed, but I was wrong. I inherited a legacy of resilience. I inherited a second chance. I inherited a connection to my father and my grandfather that was stronger than death. This place didn't just give me shelter. It gave me a purpose. It gave me a foundation on which to build my own life. It saved me. My father had called it a sanctuary. He was right. So that's my story. It's a story about how the things that seem worthless can sometimes hold the most value. It's about how the people we've lost never really leave us. And it's about how home isn't always a building, but a piece of ground where you can finally stand firm and be yourself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being a part of this journey with me. If my story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own strength, your own resilience, then I hope you'll subscribe and become a part of this community. We all have a story about finding our own piece of ground. I'd be honored if you would share a piece of yours in the comments. Tell me what home means to you. I'll be reading, as always. Because we're all in this together, building our own worth, one day at a time.